Let's meet our next guest. Joining us on the phone line is Aron Rosenberg, an education PhD student at McGill University. Aron, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on, Elias.
And I'm sure there's a whole bunch of things that are interesting about you, Aron, but the reason you're on this morning is that you took a break. You took a break from the internet for a whole year. Can you just tell our listeners about that decision and when and how you did it?
For sure. So last year in 2020, I didn't allow myself to go online, use a smartphone, or ask anyone else to do things online for me. I even wasn't allowed to look at people's screens if they were online. And this was part of research I'm doing at McGill on how high school students can be more responsible online. I was a high school teacher before grad school. And so when I went back to grad school, I was very aware of how much my students relied on the internet. And as a student now, again, myself, I started to think, wouldn't it be interesting to see what life and learning was like if I didn't have access to the internet? And I know that it's a huge privilege being a grad student, having the space to do that kind of work. Most people, I think the internet is mandatory for most people. So I had this special opportunity and I figured, why not go for it? The strange part, of course, was that 2020 was a year when a lot changed, especially about how we use the internet.
I mean, that's the thing, Aron. So did you start, was it January 1st to December 31st? What was the plan date-wise? Okay, so the whole year of 2020. Now, Aron, the pandemic hits, and the only way you can meet people or see people is via Zoom or Skype or FaceTime. Was there any moment where you said, okay, this was the wrong decision, I got to do it in a non-pandemic year?
Yeah, I mean, especially my family all lives in Alberta and in the States, and I was felt very isolated at first and was wondering how I was going to be able to keep in touch with family and friends. And I got this phone call from my uncle, and we talked for about an hour, and he was sharing all the reasons why he thought I should postpone the experiment. And this was around March or April, and he was explaining why he thought it was totally fair to take the year back on, or to take the year off of the experiment and then start again in 2021 or after the pandemic was less serious. But in the course of that phone call with my uncle, we had such a nice conversation, and I said to him, you realize that we're socializing now without the internet, like this is just a phone call. And I think that phone call ironically made me realize that actually there's all sorts of alternatives to the internet, even during a pandemic. That being said, I think especially for all sorts of bureaucratic purposes and health information and educational purposes, it's so essential that we make sure that everyone does have access to the internet if they need it. But then again, as you brought up in the last hour, there's all sorts of challenges the internet poses, like you were bringing up about false information online, or the way that our news cycle is sometimes dictated by sensational items and as opposed to more measured journalism.
Absolutely, Aron. We're with Aron Rosenberg, an education PhD student at McGill University. He took 2020 off the internet, did not go online in 2020. Aron, I wish you could see my face, by the way, because when you were saying that your family doesn't live, your family's in Alberta, is not here, my jaw dropped and I said, oh man, I can't imagine. And it's funny because I didn't even conceive of the telephone as a means or as an alternative. I was thinking, oh man, this guy's writing letters. So what was the toughest part, Aron? Yes, we got the phone and there are alternative means of communication, but what was the toughest part of 2020 without the internet for you?
I think the toughest part was actually right at the beginning of the year, before the pandemic hit, surprisingly. I for the first couple of weeks, I started to feel very disconnected from a lot of my research communities and my friends here, even my friends in Montreal. And I started to feel like almost that I didn't have a way to fill my time. Like, it wasn't boredom, but it was this feeling like, okay, I'm supposed to be doing things, but I'm not doing them. And that, after 2 or 3 weeks, it started to fade, and I started to get into really deep focuses. Like, I started to be able to journal much more critically and spend hours writing at my journal, or I was able to find a book from the 70s or 80s about digital tech, what I'm studying, and I could actually do a deep dive reading the whole book. And I think before I spent the year offline, my way of doing research or engaging in writing was always very, there was bursts of energy or bursts of creativity or reading things, but I didn't have that ability to do the deep focus. And as 2020 continued, I ended up, and I think this might be true for a lot of people during the pandemic, but I had a lot more space and time in my head, and I found I was actually more able to focus and more able to do that type of deep critical work that's such a big part of grad school.
How did you keep up with the news, Aron, in a year like 2020? La Presse, right? Like perhaps the biggest newspaper in this city. They don't even print.
Mm-hmm.
You can't even go to the newsstand and pick up a copy. So how did you keep up with the news?
I mean, I'm not saying this as a plug for your show, but the radio was a huge part of my year. CJAD, CKUT, CBC. There was a lot of really great content on the radio. And before 2020, I'm 31, so I didn't really grow up with radio in my life. And I was surprised at how much the radio speaks to me, like how much I feel like I am actually the target audience for a lot of the shows I hear on your show or on CBC or CKUT. And I find, I don't know if this is just my bias because I was listening to the radio, but I find that the news you get from these sources where journalists are trained and they have all sorts of support is often a lot more measured and a lot more less sensational. I think especially during COVID, I had a lot of friends who got quite caught up by some conspiracy theories, and I wonder if that would have happened if I had been online. I hope that I have a bit more maybe skepticism towards certain digital sources, but I think getting my news from more traditional sources allowed me to avoid some of the more conspiratorial parts of 2020, whether it was about the pandemic or the American election.
I just want to say to all our listeners, we didn't plan this out. I did not plan for this to end up being a commercial for what we do here at CJ 800 and all of those radio stations out there. I love to hear it, though, Aron. One last question here is, as we wrap up. When it comes to the year that you went through, how do you think it's going to impact, your studies, your education, and what you're doing, in your studies in education?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think the future of education is going to include more and more digital content. And I think this year, with a lot of classrooms actually moved online, we've started to explore all sorts of new ways of doing online learning or blended learning. And so having this experience, I think, has allowed me to acknowledge that there are so many really important and valuable and amazing technologies out there, but that we have to be very critical of making sure that the ones we adopt, not only are they working for us, but also we have to think about the way they might have repercussions for the environment or for labor relations or along the supply chain. So it's really, this year has been a big learning experience about balancing the parts of the internet we love and that we want to embrace and support, and also looking at the parts that we might want to push back on a little bit.
Aron, that was a really interesting discussion. I loved it. Thanks for sharing your story with our listeners.
Thanks so much for having me on.
That's Aron Rosenberg, education PhD student at McGill University, and he did not go online for all of 2020.